They said the West was won by guns and grit, but in 1887 Wyoming, it was bought with secrets. Crystal Vance was a widow with nothing left but a shotgun and a foreclosure notice. When Silas Thorne, the most dangerous man in the territory, walked through her door, she thought he was there to kill her. Instead, he offered her a ring. "You need a family," he told her, "and I need a bride." But Crystal didn't know that saying, "I do," was far more dangerous than the debt she owed, because Silas Thorne wasn't just looking for a wife, he was looking for an accomplice, and the body buried under her barn was about to change everything. The dust in Laramie didn't just coat your skin, it worked its way into your soul. Crystal Vance stood on the porch of her failing homestead, the wood rotting beneath her boots, watching the rider approach from the horizon. The Wyoming sun was a brutal, unblinking eye, bleaching the color out of the long grass. Crystal gripped the stock of her late husband's Winchester rifle. It wasn't loaded. She had sold her last box of ammunition 3 days ago to buy flour, but the man on the horse didn't need to know that. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice cracking only slightly. The rider didn't stop until the nose of his black stallion was nearly touching the porch railing. He was a mountain of a man, wearing a duster coat stained with the red clay of the Badlands and a hat pulled low over his eyes. When he looked up, Crystal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. It was Silas Thorne. Every soul in Laramie knew the name. He owned the Double Bar Tea Ranch, the largest spread of land north of the Platte River. Rumors clung to him like burrs. Some said he was a former Pinkerton agent who got too violent for the agency. Others said he was an outlaw who had bought his pardon. He had a scar running from his left ear down to his jawline, a jagged souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. "Mrs. Vance?" Silas said. His voice sounded like gravel crunching under a wagon wheel. "Mr. Thorne, if you're here for the bank, you're early. Mayor Sterling said I had until the 1st of the month." Silas swung down from his horse with surprising grace for a man of his size. He tethered the animal and stepped onto the porch. Crystal didn't lower the rifle. "I'm not here for the bank, Crystal, and if you wait for Ambrose Sterling, you'll be on the street by Tuesday. He's already sold the deed to the railway company. He's just waiting for the calendar to turn so he can kick you off legally." Crystal's heart hammered against her ribs. That can't be true. My husband, Elias, he had an agreement." "Elias is dead," Silas said, not unkindly, but with a brutal frankness that stung. "And dead men don't enforce agreements. You owe $400 in back taxes and another $300 to the general store. You have no cattle, your well is drying up, and winter is coming early this year." Crystal lowered the rifle slowly. The fight drained out of her legs. He was right. She was starving, alone, and drowning in a debt she hadn't created. "Then why are you here? To gloat? Or to offer me $5 for the land?" Silas took off his hat. His eyes were a startling, piercing blue, contrasting with his weathered face. "I'm here to make a trade." "I have nothing to trade. You have your name. You have your reputation as a decent church-going woman. And you have no attachments." He stepped closer, invading her space. "I have money. More than God, according to the town gossips. But I have a problem that money can't fix." Crystal frowned, wiping a stray hair from her forehead. "What kind of problem?" "The territorial judge, Thaddeus Moore, is coming to Laramie next week. He has the power to grant custody of certain wards. He values traditional family units, stability, a mother and a father. Silas paused, his eyes scanning the desolate horizon before locking back onto hers. I have 3 children in my care, Crystal. My brother's kids. He died in a prison brawl in Yuma last month. If I don't have a wife when Judge Moore arrives, those kids go to an orphanage in Chicago. I won't let that happen. Crystal stared at him. The feared Silas Thorne, playing nursemaid? It didn't fit. You want a nanny, she said. No, he corrected sharply. I can hire a nanny. I need a wife, a legal, binding marriage license. You need a family to pay your debts. I need a bride to keep mine. He reached into his duster and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it onto the porch railing. The heavy clink of gold coins was unmistakable. $4,000, Silas said. Enough to pay your debts, fix this farm, and set you up for life. We stay married for 1 year. After that, we can annul it, or you can leave. But for that year, you live in my house, you wear my ring, and you act the part. Crystal looked at the pouch. It was freedom. It was survival. But looking at Silas Thorne, she saw something dark shifting behind his eyes. What's the catch, Silas? No catch. He lied. She knew he was lying. Just business. And if I say no, then Mayor Sterling burns this house down on Tuesday. Crystal looked at the empty fields where Elias used to work. She looked at the fresh mound of earth where she had buried him 6 months ago. She was tired of being afraid. She reached out and took the pouch. It was heavy. 1 year, she whispered. 1 year, Silas agreed. Pack your things, Mrs. Thorne. We ride at sundown. The wedding was a sterile affair, conducted in the back room of the courthouse by a justice of the peace who smelled of stale whiskey and looked too frightened of Silas to ask questions. Crystal wore her best Sunday dress, a faded blue calico that had been patched 3 times at the hem. Silas wore a black suit that looked like it hadn't been taken out of the wardrobe since a funeral. When Silas slid the gold band onto her finger, his hand was calloused and warm. The ring was heavy, an intricate piece of jewelry that looked far too expensive for a simple rancher. It looked like an heirloom from a life Silas Thorne shouldn't have had. I do, Crystal said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. I do, Silas echoed. They didn't kiss. Silas simply nodded to the justice, tossed a silver dollar on the table, and guided Crystal out to the waiting wagon. The ride to the double-bar T was silent. The landscape changed as they moved away from the dried-out plains of Crystal's farm and toward the foothills. The grass here was greener, fed by the creek that Silas controlled. This was power. This was what men killed for. The children, Crystal said, breaking the silence as the wheels rattled over a rocky patch. What are their names? Silas stiffened slightly, his grip on the reins tightening. Toby is 10, Sarah is 6, and the baby, Jack, is barely 2. And they are your brother's children? That's what the papers say. Crystal caught the evasion. And what does the truth say? Silas turned to her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The truth is complicated, Crystal. And for your safety, it's best you stick to the papers. You're here to be a face for the judge. Don't go digging for bones you don't want to find. They arrived at the ranch house as the sun began to dip below the peaks. It was a sprawling, 2-story structure made of timber and stone, imposing and fortress-like. But as they pulled up to the main gate, Crystal noticed something unsettled. There were men patrolling the perimeter, not ranch hands herding cattle, men with rifles resting comfortably in the crooks of their arms. They watched the wagon approach with the disciplined eyes of soldiers. Why so many guards? Crystal asked. Coyotes, Silas said shortly. Coyotes don't carry repeaters, Crystal countered. Two-legged coyotes do. Silas helped her down. The front door swung open, and an older woman with a severe bun and a starch-stiff apron stepped out. This was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper. She looked Crystal up and down with open disapproval. Is this her? Mrs. Higgins asked. This is my wife, Mrs. Higgins. Crystal, Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Show her to the master bedroom. I have business in the barn. The master bedroom? Crystal asked, flustered. I thought, surely there's a guest room. Silas paused on the bottom step. We have to look real, Crystal. If Judge Moore comes by for a surprise inspection and sees separate beds, the deal is off. We share the room. He paused, his expression unreadable. I'll take the floor. I'm used to hard ground. He walked away toward the barn without looking back. Crystal watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had secured her farm, yes. But as she looked at the armed men on the fence line, in the dark windows of the massive house, she realized she had walked into a prison. Inside, the house was cold, despite the massive fireplaces. It smelled of lemon oil, beeswax, and something metallic, gun oil. Where are the children? Crystal asked Mrs. Higgins as she was led up the grand staircase. Asleep, or hiding. Mrs. Higgins grunted. They're wild things, raised by wolves if you ask me. I want to see them. Mr. Thorne gave orders. You're to settle in tonight. You meet them in the morning. Mrs. Higgins opened a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Here, don't go wandering the halls at night, Mrs. Thorne. This is an old house. It makes noises. Crystal stepped into the room. It was luxurious, with a four-poster bed and heavy velvet curtains. But the first thing she noticed wasn't the luxury. It was the lock. It was on the outside of the bedroom door. The first night was an exercise in terror. Crystal lay awake in the massive bed, clutching the quilt to her chin. Silas never came to the room. He had stayed in the barn or his study. She didn't know which. What she did know was that the house was not sleeping. Around 2 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, dragging steps. Then a hushed argument. Too dangerous, Silas. If Sterling finds out, let him come. I'll bury him next to the others. Crystal recognized Silas's voice. The other voice was higher, frantic. It sounded like the town doctor, Doc Pendergast. Why would the doctor be here in the middle of the night? The next morning, the sun revealed the beauty of the ranch, masking the shadows of the night before. Crystal dressed quickly and went downstairs, determined to find the children. She found them in the kitchen, creating chaos. Toby, the 10-year-old, was trying to stab a piece of ham with a knife that looked far too sharp for a child. Sarah was under the table, refusing to come out, and the baby, Jack, was screaming in a high chair while Mrs. Higgins ignored them all, aggressively kneading dough. Put the knife down, Crystal said, stepping into the room. Her voice was firm, the tone she used when a stubborn mule wouldn't budge. Toby looked up. He had Silas's dark hair, but eyes that were full of fear and anger. Who are you? I'm Crystal. I'm staying here for a while. You the new mom? Toby sneered. The last one ran away. Crystal froze. The last one? Miss Miller, she was the nanny. She said Uncle Silas was the devil, and she ran off in the night. Toby! Mrs. Higgins snapped. Eat your breakfast. Crystal walked over to Toby and gently but firmly took the knife from his hand. He flinched, as if expecting a blow. That reaction, told Crystal more than any gossip could. These children had seen violence. "I'm not going to run away," Crystal said softly. She crouched down to look under the table. Sarah was huddled there, clutching a rag doll that was missing an arm. "Hello, Sarah." Sarah stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Is the bad man gone?" "Which bad man?" Crystal asked. "The one who yells at Uncle Silas. The one who wants the map." Crystal's blood ran cold. The map. Before she could ask more, the kitchen door slammed open. Silas stood there, looking exhausted. He hadn't slept. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and there was fresh mud on his boots. "Mrs. Higgins, take the children to the nursery," Silas commanded. "But we haven't finished," Crystal began. "Now," Silas barked. The housekeeper ushered the children out. The room fell silent. Silas poured himself black coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "You were up late," Crystal said, testing the waters. "I heard voices." "You heard the wind," Silas said, his back to her. "I heard Doc Pendergast. Is someone hurt, Silas?" Silas turned slowly. The morning light caught the scar on his face, making it look angry and red. "You are here to play a role, Crystal, not to investigate. Judge Moore arrives in 3 days. Until then, you focus on the children. You make them look loved. You make them look safe." "They don't feel safe, Silas. Sarah is talking about bad men and maps. Toby thinks I'm going to vanish. What have you dragged me into?" Silas slammed the coffee cup down, shattering the saucer. "I dragged you out of poverty. I saved your life." "You bought my life," Crystal shouted back. "There is a difference." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Silas stared at her, his chest heaving. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. But then, his shoulders slumped. The anger evaporated, leaving just a bone-deep weariness. "They aren't safe," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Not yet. That's why I need the custody papers. Once they are legally mine, Sterling can't touch them without bringing the federal government down on his head." "Sterling? The mayor?" Crystal asked, confused. "Why does the mayor want your brother's children?" Silas walked to the window, looking out at the armed guards patrolling the fence. "Because they aren't my brother's children, Crystal." He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes was one of desperate plea. "They are the children of Josiah Sterling, the mayor's younger brother, a train robber who stole $50,000 in gold bonds from the Union Pacific 3 years ago. Josiah died in prison, but the gold was never found. Everyone thinks he told his kids where it was hidden before he was captured." Crystal gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The map. Sarah talked about a map." "There is no map," Silas said grimly. "But Ambrose Sterling, the mayor, doesn't believe that. He wants custody so he can squeeze the location out of them. He'll torture them if he has to. He's already tried to kidnap them twice. That's why I have guards." "And you?" Crystal asked. "Why do you have them?" "Because their mother was my sister," Silas said. "Josiah Sterling stole her, and he stole her life. I couldn't save her. But I will be damned to hell before I let that family take her children." Crystal looked at the man she had married, the monster the town feared. He wasn't a villain. He was a besieged fortress, holding the line against a corrupt town, protecting 3 innocent lives. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the morning air. Then another. Silas drew his Colt Peacemaker in a blur of motion. "Get down!" he roared. The kitchen window shattered as a bullet tore through the glass, embedding itself in the wall inches from Crystal's head. The siege had begun. The kitchen exploded into chaos. The bullet that missed Crystal had punched a hole in the plaster, sending white dust drifting through the air like snow. Silas didn't hesitate. He flipped the heavy oak table onto its side, shoving Crystal behind it. "Stay down!" he roared, sliding across the floor to the window. He shattered the remaining glass with the butt of his peacemaker and fired 2 shots into the yard. A man screamed outside, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. "Are they gone?" Crystal gasped, clutching her chest. "Regrouping," Silas grunted. He reloaded with practiced, terrifying speed. "Sterling's hired guns. They're testing the perimeter, trying to draw my guards away from the house. You said we were safe inside." "I said the house was a fortress." "Fortresses get besieged, Crystal." Silas looked at her, his blue eyes burning. "Do you know how to use a gun?" Crystal thought of the unloaded Winchester back at her farm. She thought of the nights she spent listening to the wolves howl, aiming at shadows. "Yes." Silas pulled a smaller revolver, a Schofield .45, from a holster hidden beneath the cupboard. He checked the cylinder and handed it to her. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of oil. "Go to the nursery. Guard the door. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me or Mrs. Higgins, you pull the trigger. You don't aim for the leg. You aim for the chest. Do you understand?" Crystal's hands trembled, but she nodded. "Silas, be careful." He didn't answer. He turned and ran toward the front hall, his duster billowing behind him like a cape. Crystal scrambled up the back stairs, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The nursery was at the end of the hall. She burst in to find Mrs. Higgins holding a crying Jack, while Toby and Sarah huddled in the corner. "Mrs. Thorne?" Mrs. Higgins looked pale, her severity replaced by fear. "Get away from the window," Crystal ordered, surprised by the steel in her own voice. She dragged a heavy dresser in front of the door, barricading them in. Silas is holding them off. Downstairs, the war began. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a thunderous exchange of lead. Crystal could hear the thud, thud, thud of bullets hitting the thick logs of the house. She heard glass breaking, men shouting, and the distinct booming report of Silas's Colt. Toby stood up, his small fists clenched. "I want to help him. I have a knife." "You sit down, Toby," Crystal snapped, pulling him back. "Your uncle is fighting to keep you alive. Don't make him worry about you, too." Sarah began to weep, rocking back and forth, clutching her rag doll. "The bad men want the map. The bad men want the map." Crystal knelt beside her, keeping the gun trained on the barricaded door. "Sarah, look at me. There is no map. Uncle Silas said so." "Daddy gave it to me," Sarah whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "He put it in Mr. Waffles." Crystal frowned. "Mr. Waffles?" Sarah held up the dirty one-armed rag doll. "Daddy said Mr. Waffles has a full tummy. He said never to let him get hungry." The gunfire downstairs paused. The silence was heavier than the noise. Crystal's mind raced. A full tummy. She looked at the doll. It was lumpy, poorly stitched. The fabric was worn, but the torso of the doll felt stiff, crinkly. "Sarah," Crystal said gently, "may I hold Mr. Waffles for a second?" The girl hesitated, then handed the doll over. Crystal felt the torso. Beneath the cotton stuffing, there was something else, something that felt like parchment. She looked at the stitching on the back of the doll. It was crude, done with a different color thread than the rest of the toy. Josiah Sterling hadn't just stolen the gold, he had hidden the location in the one place no lawman would tear apart. A child's comfort object. Crystal handed the doll back just as heavy boots pounded up the stairs. She raised the revolver, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Crystal, open up." It was Silas. Crystal shoved the dresser aside. Silas stumbled in, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was seeping through his white shirt, turning the fabric a dark, sticky crimson. "Silas!" Crystal dropped the gun and rushed to him. "I'm fine," he grimaced, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a graze. They're retreating. The ranch hands flanked them from the bunkhouse." "You're bleeding," she said, her voice trembling. "I've had worse shaving," he lied. He looked at the children. "Is everyone all right?" Toby ran to him, wrapping his arms around Silas's leg. Silas winced, but placed a hand on the boy's head. For the first time, Crystal saw the softness in him. He wasn't just a guardian. He was a father in every way that mattered. "We need to get that bullet out," Crystal said, taking charge. "Mrs. Higgins, boil water. Silas, sit down before you fall down." As she cut away his shirt to reveal the angry, jagged tear in his shoulder, Silas watched her face. "You didn't run," he said softly. "I signed a contract," Crystal replied, dabbing alcohol on the wound. He hissed in pain. 1 year, remember? Most people would breach contract over a gunfight. Crystal looked him in the eye, her hands bloody with his blood. "I'm not most people. And Silas?" "Yeah? I know where the map is." Silas froze. "What?" "It's in the doll," she whispered, leaning close so the children wouldn't hear. "Sarah told me. It's sewn inside." Silas looked across the room at the little girl, hugging the dirty rag doll. A look of horror crossed his face. "If Sterling knows that—" "He suspects," Crystal said. "That's why he wants custody. He doesn't just want the kids. He wants their toys." Silas closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall. "Judge Moore arrives tomorrow. If we survive the night, we have to convince him we're a perfect family. If we fail, Sterling takes the kids. And once he has the kids, he tears that doll apart," Crystal finished, "and then he kills them." The next morning, the Double Bar Tea Ranch looked less like a home and more like a crime scene that had been hastily scrubbed. Crystal and Mrs. Higgins had spent the entire night replacing broken glass, scrubbing blood from the floorboards, and plastering over the bullet holes in the kitchen wall. They hung a large landscape painting over the spot where the slug had nearly killed Crystal. Silas sat at the head of the dining table, his left arm in a sling hidden beneath his suit jacket. He looked pale, the loss of blood taking its toll, but his eyes were alert. "He's here," one of the ranch hands called from the doorway. A black carriage with gold trim rolled through the gate, flanked by 2 mounted deputies. Judge Thaddeus Moore was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. Gray hair, gray suit, and a face that hadn't smiled since the Grant administration. "Remember," Silas hissed to Crystal as they walked out to the porch. "We are happy. We are boring. And I am not shot." "Smile, Silas," Crystal whispered back, hooking her arm through his good one. "You look like you're facing a firing squad." "I might be." Judge Moore stepped down from the carriage. He didn't offer a hand. He simply adjusted his spectacles and peered at them. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne." "Your Honor," Silas nodded. "Welcome to our home." "We shall see if it is a home," Moore said dryly, "or merely a hideout." The inspection was grueling. Moore checked the pantry, the bedrooms, and the school books. He asked Toby to recite the Lord's Prayer, which he did, stumbling only twice, and inspected the baby's crib for cleanliness. Through it all, Crystal played the part of the doting wife. She poured tea. She laughed at the judge's dry comments, and she touched Silas's arm affectionately whenever she could. It was an act, but as the hours wore on, it felt less like lying. She found herself naturally covering for Silas's stiffness, translating his grunts into polite conversation. "You have done adequate work with the house," Moore admitted over dinner. The roast beef was tough. Mrs. Higgins was too stressed to cook well, but the wine was expensive. However, the question of custody remains. The mayor has filed a petition claiming you are unfit, Mr. Thorne. He cites your colorful past. "My past is past," Silas said, gripping his fork so hard his knuckles turned white. "I provide for these children. I protect them. Protection is one thing. Environment is another. A ranch is a dangerous place." Moore's eyes drifted to the fresh plaster on the kitchen wall. "I smell gunpowder, Mr. Thorne, and I see fresh glass in the window frames." Silas stiffened. "We had a coyote problem last night. My men handled it. With a Gatling gun, by the sound of the reports I received in town?" Moore raised an eyebrow. Before Silas could answer, the front door burst open. "Good evening, Judge." Mayor Ambrose Sterling strode in, uninvited. He was a slick man in a striped suit, smelling of bay rum and corruption. Behind him walked the sheriff, a man named Gower, who had been bought and paid for years ago. "Mayor Sterling." Silas stood up, his hand drifting toward his hip before he remembered he wasn't wearing his gun belt. "You're trespassing." "I'm visiting a constituent," Sterling smirked. He looked at Crystal, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory gleam. "And the lovely new bride. Mrs. Vance, isn't it? Or Mrs. Thorne now. Tell me, Crystal, did the check clear?" Crystal felt a flush of shame, but she lifted her chin. "My name is Mrs. Thorne, and you will leave my house." "Not just yet." Sterling turned to the judge. "Thaddeus, I have new evidence. Evidence that proves Silas Thorne is not just unfit, but a criminal." Sterling snapped his fingers. Sheriff Gower stepped forward, holding a dirty, rusted lockbox. "We found this buried in the creek bed near the property line," Sterling announced. "It belongs to the Union Pacific train robbers, my brother's gang." Silas narrowed his eyes. "I've never seen that box in my life." "Open it," Sterling commanded. The sheriff cracked the lock. Inside were stacks of bonded paper, railway shares, and a gun. "This is the pistol that killed the train conductor," Sterling said triumphantly, "and look at the initials carved into the handle." He held it up. "S.T." "Silas Thorne?" the judge read. He looked at Silas, his face hardening. "That's a plant," Silas shouted, wincing as his shoulder flared with pain. Sterling put it there. "Arrest him," Sterling ordered the sheriff. "Now hold on." Crystal stepped between the sheriff and Silas. "You can't come into our home and plant evidence. This man has been with me." "Move aside, ma'am," Sheriff Gower grunted, shoving Crystal out of the way. He grabbed Silas's bad arm. Silas roared in pain, his knees buckling. "Careful," Crystal screamed. "He's hurt." "Hurt?" The judge stood up. "From the coyote hunt, Mr. Thorne." Silas was dragged to his feet, breathing heavy. He looked at Crystal. "The children," he gasped. "Get them upstairs." "Take him away," Sterling smiled. "And Judge, since the guardian is being arrested for murder, I assume custody reverts to the next of kin, which would be me." "Under the law?" Judge Moore hesitated, looking at the scene. "Yes. Pending trial, the children go to the uncle." "No!" Crystal screamed. "You can't take them." "I'll be back for them in the morning," Sterling said, smoothing his lapel. "Have them packed, Crystal. And don't try to run. My men are watching the road." They dragged Silas out into the night. Crystal stood in the doorway, watching the wagon disappear into the darkness. She was alone. The house was silent. And somewhere upstairs, inside a rag doll, sat the only thing that could save them, or get them all killed. Crystal didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair in the nursery, the Winchester rifle across her lap. Mrs. Higgins had taken the children to the attic, hiding them behind a false wall used during the Indian Wars. The situation was impossible. Silas was in the Laramie jail, likely to be hanged before the week was out. Sterling was coming at dawn to take the children, and the judge was either a fool or a coward. Crystal looked at the doll, Mr. Waffles, sitting on the nightstand. She picked up a pair of sewing scissors. "Forgive me, Sarah," she whispered. She snipped the threads on the doll's back. Digging through the cotton stuffing, her fingers brushed against something stiff. She pulled it out. It wasn't paper. It was a piece of tanned leather, no bigger than a playing card. Burned into the leather were lines, a topographic map of the Devil's Tower Canyon, and an X marked near a specific cave formation known as the Dead Man's Drop. Crystal knew the spot. It was treacherous, filled with rattlesnakes and loose rock. She had the map. She had the leverage. But she couldn't use it to bargain with Sterling. He would just kill her and take it. She needed to break Silas out. But she was one woman against a town owned by the mayor. Crystal stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the moon. She wasn't Crystal Vance, the helpless widow, anymore. She was Crystal Thorne, and she had $4,000 in gold in her heavy pouch. "Mrs. Higgins?" Crystal called out softly. The housekeeper emerged from the shadows. "Keep the children hidden. If I'm not back by dawn, take the horses and ride for the state line." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to buy an army." Laramie at midnight was a dangerous place, but Crystal walked straight into the Red Dog Saloon. The piano stopped. The conversations died. Every eye turned to the woman in the high-collared dress standing in the doorway, with a rifle in one hand and a heavy sack in the other. Crystal scanned the room until she saw him. Black Jack Grady, a notorious outlaw who had ridden with Billy the Kid. He was sitting at a far table, nursing a whiskey. Silas had mentioned him once, said Grady owed him a favor for not turning him in last winter. Crystal walked up to his table and slammed the sack of gold onto the wood. It split open, spilling coins everywhere. "I need 5 men," Crystal said, her voice ringing through the silent bar. "Good shots. No consciences." Grady looked at the gold, then up at Crystal. He tipped his hat slowly. "And who might you be, lady?" "I'm Mrs. Silas Thorne, and I'm breaking my husband out of jail." A murmur went through the room. Grady grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "Silas got himself hitched? Well, I'll be damned. What's the pay?" "Everything on the table," Crystal said, "and the mayor's head on a platter." Grady stood up. He looked around the bar. "Boys, drink up. The lady is paying for a jailbreak." The jailhouse was a small brick building at the end of Main Street. Sheriff Gower was sitting at his desk, feet up, counting the bribe money Sterling had given him. He didn't hear the door open. He only heard the cocking of a dozen hammers. He looked up to see Crystal Vance standing there, flanked by Black Jack Grady and 4 of the meanest-looking desperados in the territory. "Keys," Crystal said. "Now, Mrs. Thorne," Gower stammered, reaching for his gun. "Don't," Grady warned, pressing the cold barrel of a shotgun to Gower's temple. "I've been itching to shoot a sheriff all year." Gower tossed the keys. Crystal ran to the back cells. Silas was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands. When he heard the key turn, he looked up, expecting the executioner. Crystal? He stared at her, then at the outlaws behind her. What in God's name? I hired help, she said, unlocking the door. Can you ride? I can ride, Silas grinned, pain and pride warring in his eyes. You crazy woman. You'll be wanted in 3 states. I don't care, Crystal said, helping him up. We have to go. Sterling is going to the ranch at dawn. Let's go welcome him, Silas said darkly. The sun was just cresting the peaks when Mayor Sterling's carriage arrived at the Double Bar T. He had brought the judge with him, wanting to make the seizure of the children official. Open the gate, Sterling shouted. The gate swung open, but it wasn't Mrs. Higgins who walked out. It was Silas Thorne. He was wearing fresh clothes, his arm in a sling, his Colt Peacemaker back on his hip. Beside him stood Crystal, holding the Winchester. And behind them, lining the porch railing, were Blackjack Grady and his gang. Sterling's face went white. You're supposed to be in a cell. Change of plans, Silas called out. Judge Moore, I'd like to report a crime. The judge looked from the armed outlaws to the mayor. He was a survivor, first and foremost. What crime is that, Mr. Thorne? Kidnapping, extortion, and attempted murder. Silas stepped off the porch. Crystal? Crystal stepped forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather map. This is what you want, isn't it, Ambrose? She yelled. Sterling's eyes bulged. Give that to me. It's evidence. It's a map to $50,000 in gold bonds, Crystal declared, and I'm going to give it to the only person who deserves it. She struck a match on the porch railing. No! Sterling screamed, jumping from the carriage. Crystal held the flame to the dry, old leather. It caught instantly. She held it until the heat licked her fingers, then dropped it into the dirt. The location of the fortune curled into black ash. It's gone, Crystal said. The gold is lost forever. You have no reason to want these children now, Ambrose. Sterling pulled a hidden derringer from his sleeve. You stupid beep. Bang! The shot didn't come from Silas. It came from Crystal. She fired the Winchester from the hip. The bullet struck the dirt inches from Sterling's boot, sending him stumbling back. The next one doesn't miss, Crystal warned. Get off my land. Sterling looked around. The judge was staring at him with disgust. The sheriff was nowhere to be found, and Silas Thorne looked ready to tear him apart with his bare hands. This isn't over, Sterling spat. It is for you. Judge Moore spoke up. Mayor Sterling, I believe the federal marshals will be very interested to hear about your extrajudicial activities regarding the Thorne family. I suggest you resign. Immediately. Sterling scrambled back into his carriage and whipped the horses, fleeing in a cloud of dust. Silas walked up to Crystal. He looked at the pile of ash on the ground. You burned it, he said. $50,000. It was blood money, Crystal said, her hands finally starting to shake. I didn't want it buying our future. Silas reached out with his good hand and cupped her face. He looked at her not as a business partner, not as a debt settlement, but as a woman who had walked through fire for him. You realize we're broke? He said softly. I have a farm. Crystal smiled weakly. The soil is bad, but with a little work. We have a ranch, Silas corrected. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the cold ceremony of the courthouse. It was searing, desperate, and full of promise. When they pulled apart, the front door creaked open. Toby, Sarah, and Jack ran out onto the porch. Is the bad man gone? Sarah asked. Crystal turned. wrapping her arm around Silas's waist. "Yes, sweetie," she said. "He's gone for good." The dust didn't settle immediately. In the hours following Mayor Sterling's frantic retreat, the Double Bar T was a hive of nervous energy. The federal marshals, summoned by Judge Moore's telegram, wouldn't arrive for another week. But the power vacuum Sterling left behind was instant and palpable. Silas stood by the corral fence, watching Blackjack Grady and his men mount their horses. The outlaws looked out of place against the backdrop of the domestic ranch, predators pausing in a pasture. Silas held a heavy sack in his good hand. He tossed it to Grady. "That's the last of the cash from the safe," Silas said, his voice tight. "Every dollar I had on hand." Grady caught the sack, weighing it in his palm. He grinned, the gold tooth glinting in the morning sun. "Pleasure doing business with you, Thorne. Though I gotta say, your wife is the one with the grit. You might be the muscle, but she's the trigger." "Ride out, Jack," Silas warned, though there was no heat in it, "before the marshals get curious." As the outlaws thundered off, Crystal stepped off the porch. She looked exhausted. Her dress was stained with gunpowder and dirt, and her hair was coming loose from its pins. But she didn't look broken. She looked like the mistress of the land. "We're broke, aren't we?" she asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Silas looked at the empty horizon where the dust from Grady's gang was settling. "I have cattle. I have land. But liquid cash? We don't have enough to buy a sack of flour." "We'll manage," Crystal said, and for the first time, Silas believed she actually meant it. The weeks that followed were a different kind of battle. It wasn't fought with Winchesters and Colts, but with ledgers, pride, and the biting winds of an early Wyoming winter. Mayor Sterling had fled to San Francisco, and the corruption that had rotted Laramie began to clear. Without Sterling's pressure, the bank suddenly discovered a clerical error regarding Crystal's old farm. The foreclosure was canceled. It was a hollow victory. The farm was still failing, but it was a vindication. Crystal insisted on going into town herself to settle the final accounts. Silas tried to stop her, worried about lingering resentment, but she refused. She took the wagon, dressed in her best blue calico, and walked into the general store. The shopkeeper, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who had refused her credit 2 weeks ago, nearly dropped a jar of pickled eggs when she entered. The silence in the store was deafening. The town gossips, usually buzzing like flies, went still. Crystal walked to the counter, placing a small stack of coins, her last few dollars, on the wood. "I believe this covers the bill for the flour and the ammunition," she said, her voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mrs. Thorne," Abernathy stammered, wiping his hands on his apron. "There was no need, given the circumstances, the mayor's lies. The debt was real, regardless of the mayor," Crystal cut him off. "And a Thorne pays their debts." She turned to leave, and for the first time in years, the men on the boardwalk tipped their hats to her. She wasn't just the poor widow Vance anymore. She was the woman who had stared down a corrupt regime and won. She drove the wagon back to the ranch with her head held high, the cold wind feeling less like an assault and more like a welcome. Back at the ranch, the transition from a business arrangement to a family was messy, loud, and undeniably real. Silas's shoulder was slow to heal. The bullet had chipped the bone, leaving him unable to lift a saddle or chop wood for a month. For a man defined by his physical capability, the idleness was torture. He stalked the house like a caged panther, growling at the pain and frustration. It was Toby who broke the tension. One evening, snow was piling up against the windows, sealing the house in a white tomb. Silas was trying to mend a bridle one-handed by the fire, cursing under his breath as the leather slipped his grasp. "You're doing it wrong," Toby said. The 10-year-old was sitting on the rug, whittling a stick. Silas glared at him. "Is that so?" "Yeah. You gotta hold the buckle with your teeth if your arm's bad. That's what Mr. Grady did when he fixed his stirrup." Silas paused. He looked at the boy. Really looked at him. The fear that had defined Toby's eyes for months was gone. In its place was a cautious insolence, the kind a boy only shows to a man he trusts enough to test. "Come here," Silas grunted. Toby scrambled over. "Hold the buckle," Silas commanded, "and don't tell your aunt I let you near the good leather." They worked in silence for an hour, the man and the boy, fixing the tack. When Crystal came in later to check on them, she found Toby asleep against Silas's good side, and Silas staring into the fire with a look of profound peace on his scarred face. "He looks like you," Crystal whispered, placing a blanket over the boy. "He's stubborn like his mother," Silas replied softly. He looked up at Crystal. "They're safe, Crystal, because of you. I never thought I'd see them sleep without one eye open." "You did that, Silas. You gave them a home. A house," he corrected. "You gave them a home." By the time the deep freeze of January set in, the reality of their financial situation could no longer be ignored. The cattle drive money had paid off the hired guns, but the feed bills were piling up. The winter was harsh, and they lost 20 head of cattle to the drifts. One evening, late in the month, Crystal found Silas on the porch. He was bundled in his heavy duster, smoking a cheroot, staring at the silhouette of the mountains against the moonlight. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and wood smoke, but heavy with unspoken worry. Crystal stepped out, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She handed him a mug of hot cider. "You'll catch your death out here," she said. "Thinking keeps me warm," Silas replied, though he took the mug. His hand brushed hers, lingering for a moment before pulling away. "You're thinking about money," Crystal stated. It wasn't a question. Silas sighed, a plume of white breath escaping into the night. "I'm thinking about the spring. We need seed. We need to repair the barn roof before the rains come. And I'm thinking about Toby's schooling. There's a boarding school in Denver. He's bright, Crystal. He shouldn't grow up punching cows." "He loves the cows," Crystal smiled. "But I agree, he needs options." Silas turned to her, his expression serious. The moonlight caught the silver in his beard and the jagged line of the scar on his cheek. "I failed you, Crystal. I promised you $4,000. I promised you security. Instead, you're nursing a cripple and raising 3 orphans on a failing ranch." "I haven't complained," Crystal said softly. "That makes it worse," Silas groaned. "I dragged you into this war. We won, but at what cost? That map, that $50,000. He shook his head, looking out toward the jagged peak of Devil's Tower in the distance. "I know why you burned it. I do. It was the only way to stop Sterling. But God help me, sometimes I lie awake at night and imagine what that gold could have done." Crystal set her mug down on the railing. She turned to face him fully. "Silas, look at me." He turned, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of adoration and regret. "Do you trust me?" she asked. "With my life. You know that? Do you trust my memory?" Silas frowned, confused. What does that have to do with anything? Crystal took a step closer, invading his space, the heat radiating off him, fighting the chill of the night. She reached up and tapped her temple with a gloved finger. Devil's Tower, she recited, her voice clear and precise. The canyon floor, 300 paces east of the Dead Man's Drop. Look for a limestone formation shaped like a split anvil. Dig 3 feet down. Silas went perfectly still. The wind howled around the eaves of the house, but on the porch, time seemed to freeze. He stared at her, his mouth falling open slightly. You memorized it. I was a schoolteacher before I was a farmer's wife, Silas, she said, a mischievous spark dancing in her eyes. I taught geography. I know every peak and valley in this territory. When I saw that map, I didn't just see lines. I saw the land. But you burned it, he whispered, as if afraid saying it too loud would break the spell. I watched it turn to ash. Sterling watched it turn to ash. I burned a piece of leather, Crystal corrected, reaching out to smooth the lapel of his coat. I didn't burn the information. I couldn't let Sterling have it, and I couldn't let you go chasing after it while bullets were flying. We needed to survive first. Silas made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as the widow he had bought, not as the partner he had fought beside, but as a force of nature that he was lucky enough to stand near. $50,000, he murmured. It's still there. It's buried under 3 feet of dirt and snow, Crystal said. It will wait until spring. When the snow melts, we'll take the wagon. We'll pack a picnic. The children can play in the creek while we do some gardening. A picnic, Silas repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. You are a dangerous woman, Mrs. Thorne. I'm a practical woman, she countered. And I'm a mother. Mothers plan ahead. Silas didn't speak. He simply reached out with his good arm and pulled her into him. It wasn't the tentative, polite contact of the last few months. It was a desperate, claiming embrace. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of soap and lavender. I thought I saved you, he mumbled into her hair. But you saved us. You saved all of us. Crystal wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. You gave me a reason to fight, Silas. That's all I ever needed. He pulled back just enough to look at her. The regret was gone from his eyes, replaced by a burning intensity that made Crystal's breath hitch. The contract, he said hoarsely. 1 year, that was the deal. The contract was for a housekeeper and a fake wife, Crystal whispered. I think we've breached the terms. Then we should renegotiate, Silas said. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the cold ceremony in the courthouse. It was searing and possessive, full of the fire that had kept them alive through the siege. It was a promise made not in ink, but in blood and survival. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the cold night felt miles away. Come inside, Crystal, Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. It's cold out here, and you need a family. Crystal smiled, taking his hand and squeezing it tight. She looked back one last time at the mountain where their future lay buried, then turned her eyes back to the man who was her present. And you need a bride, she finished for him. I have one, Silas said, opening the door to the warmth of the house. I have the only one that matters. Crystal stepped across the threshold, into the light, into the noise of the children playing, into the warmth of the fire. She was already home. And there you have it, the story of Crystal and Silas Thorne. I have to be honest, I did not see that twist coming. I really thought she burned the fortune to save the family, but it turns out Crystal is playing 4D chess while everyone else is playing checkers. That reveal on the porch gave me chills. It's the perfect example of how sometimes the quietest character in the room is actually the most dangerous. If you enjoyed this Wild West saga, the romance, the shootouts, and that incredibly satisfying ending, please destroy that like button. It really helps the channel and tells YouTube you want more long-form stories like this one. If you were in Crystal's shoes, would you have told Silas about the map immediately? Or would you have waited until the danger was completely gone like she did? Let me know your strategy in the comments down below. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm currently researching a Victorian-era mystery involving a cursed diamond and a locked room murder for our next video. And trust me, you do not want to miss it. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.